It's so wonderful to be here. Let me first start off by also acknowledging traditional owners on the land on which we gather here tonight and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And also to thank BDS Australia for organising the event tonight because, this book came out a few months ago. I'm going to talk a bit about what the book's about and why I think its message seems to have resonated. And what's been so really extraordinary is that it came out here in the US and the UK in May. And it seems to me, I don't want to exaggerate or disappoint, but what seems to have happened is that there is a shift going on, and I'll talk more about this later, a shift going on in how many people perceive Palestine and an openness to want to talk and understand what's happening in Palestine. Obviously, what's happening in Palestine itself has arguably never been worse, which we'll get to in a minute. So there's a disconnect between the growing openness in parts of the West particularly, and non-West of course, but I'm talking mostly about US, UK, Europe, Australia to an extent. Not talking about at a government level here, I'm talking about a person level, and again I'll get more into detail about that. And the response to the book is, I remember the book came out a few months ago, and a week before it came out I was doing a 10-minute interview on MSNBC, which is a very corporate, pro-democrat TV network, not really friendly of Palestine. The idea that there'd be a space for that, to have an open discussion about, but there was no holes barred. Talked about apartheid and Palestine. I could say what I want. I wasn't censored. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of that suddenly the occupation will end tomorrow. No. What I'm saying is there's a shift going on, and maybe this book, amongst others, is part of that shift. The book itself is not really about me, but let me briefly say a little bit about myself for those who don't know, because I think to some extent, as Kathy said, my journey, so to speak, is interesting and increasingly, thankfully, not so unique. I grew up in Melbourne far too many years ago, and as a Jewish person from Melbourne, my family escaped the Nazi Europe in 1939. The ones who didn't escape were killed in the Holocaust, and the ones who came out got a visa wherever they could. So it was Australia, UK, US, Canada. And the ones who came to Australia came in 1939 and settled in Melbourne. And when I was growing up in the mid-70s and 80s, Israel wasn't the centre of our lives by any means, but it was simply expected that you support Israel. This was just how it was. We're Jews support Israel. This wasn't really questioned at all in my family, and frankly most of the Jewish community for years. There were people in the Jewish community, of course, who didn't have that view. Undeniably true. But the vast majority of Jews in the Jewish community, and there are now roughly 100,000 Jews in Australia, so it's a relatively small community, roughly between Sydney and Melbourne. And it's interesting to note that Melbourne has, just as a sort of interesting factoid, one of the highest per capita Holocaust survivors in the world is in Melbourne. And I think that does to some extent explain a lot of the rabid pro-Israel support that exists in Australia. It's not necessarily an automatic connection, but I think it does explain some of that. So when I was growing up in Melbourne, the idea of being critical of Israel or supporting Palestine was just an anathema. I mean, completely an impossibility, not because I wasn't allowed, but I don't have any recollection of meeting a Palestinian until I was, God knows, far too old. I'm going to say 20. I just didn't meet one. There were Palestinians in Melbourne, of course, but I didn't meet any. The Jewish community that I was involved with, I went to a non-Jewish school, but the Jewish community being pro-Israel was simply a given. That the idea that, and I heard this constantly at family dinners and family events, at the family synagogue, we used to go now and then for Jewish holidays on the Sabbath, was Palestinians are terrorists and we can't deal with these people. They're terrorists. It's us or them. It's very binary. It's us or them. We survived the Holocaust, now it's our turn. So the line went. And when you're 10 or 12, you probably believe that. You don't have a knowledge, understanding, history to really get what is being said. But in my teens, I started feeling a real discomfort and anger, I guess, about that. I couldn't really fully explain that. And I think it's important to note that this was actually before the age of the internet, and that actually matters because I think so much of this shift, which I'll talk about more, has happened because of the internet. I'm not this utopian about the internet's also got huge amounts of crazy, awful shit as well, as we all know. But there's also positivity, and I think the lack of a filter that now exists for many people around the world to see what's happening in Palestine by Palestinians these days, whether it's on social media, has been a profound impact. And it's much harder to control the narrative now than it was, frankly, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So, to fast forward many years, I started writing about Palestine in 2003, 20 years ago actually. I'd moved to Sydney from Melbourne. I'd never been to Palestine at all at that stage, never lived there, never visited there. I had a lot of Jewish friends who had been there on what I would call propaganda trips, which is common. For those who don't know, when you're a Jewish teenager, it's encouraged by your family and the community to go to Israel and kind of fly the flag. And in the US, it's called birthright. Here, it's called something different, but it's similar. It's a 2-week trip. Usually it's paid for by someone else. And you're going to kind of go as an 18-year-old kid and have a party, and you don't learn anything about, you don't speak to Palestinians, God forbid, can you imagine? But the idea is to do two things. To bring back a love of Israel, if you haven't got it already, and secondly, to make sure that you chances are partner with a Jew. And this is really important part of this point. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you listen to most of the Jewish establishment here and in the US in the last decades, the idea of marrying out, meaning marrying or having kids with a non-Jew, is seen as an existential crisis. That our responsibility, so we're told, is to be with each other, to be with Jews. Now, this is not in one level unique to the Jewish community. There are many other communities also say you should marry your, an Iraqi or whatever you may be. It's not unique to the Jewish community, I know that. But within the Jewish community, this idea somehow that, and this was often the way it was sold to me, was after everything we've been through, we being Jews, you want to have a non-Jewish kid? And just so those who don't know, in the Jewish line, it goes through the mother. So in my case, if I'm with a non-Jewish woman, which I am now, thankfully, not thankfully, but I am, the children are not technically Jewish according to traditional Jewish law, which obviously doesn't concern me enough to not do it. But this is a strong line in the Jewish community, then and now. So the idea of going to Israel as an 18, 19, 20-year-old is to have a great time, have a great party for 2 weeks, and hopefully either partner up with a Jew or make yourselves convinced that you should only go out with Jewish people. Men, women, whatever is your thing. And I didn't do that trip, for better or worse. Fast forward to 2003, and I'll just summarise this briefly because the book's not about this really at all, but it's an interesting, I think, background to understand how there's been a shift within the Jewish community in the last decades. That I wrote my first piece for the Sydney Morning Herald in 2003. And back then, I saw myself as not a radical. I said I believe in a two-state solution. I definitely believe in Israel as a Jewish state. I mean, God forbid I'm an anti-Zionist. Can you imagine? I definitely did not say any of that. But I used the word apartheid. I'm not saying yay me, but I used the word what's happening in Palestine is apartheid, which it was then and clearly is now. And the Jewish community lost their shit. I mean, there's no other way to explain this. It was kind of ridiculous because Palestinians had been saying this for decades. Other Jews, I wasn't the first one, had been saying this for decades, not as many as they should, but they were. And I then ended up, as Kathy mentioned, I wrote a book called My Israel Question in 2006, which again, in hindsight, I look at it now, was pretty moderate. It wasn't some crazy radical text calling for, jihad against Israel, two-state solution, believe in Israel as a Jewish state. That's actually a Australian and American government policy, by the way. That's the policy then and now. A year before the book came out, a then MP, Michael Danby, who I miss very much, he's not in Parliament anymore, came out in Parliament in Canberra condemning the book, saying it was a disgrace. I hadn't written it. I hadn't come out. I'd sent in questions which were reasonable, saying, they were reasonable questions. The book comes out in 2006, and within a matter of weeks it was a bestseller, which was partly because the Jewish community was trying to attack anyone who gave it a space to be heard. My publisher was then Melbourne University Press, who was then run by Louise Adler, who now some of you may know now runs the Adelaide Writers' Festival, and this year, to her great credit, invited many Palestinians to speak at that festival. Despite all the shit that she faced, she held firm, and I really respect her for that. But back then she ran MUP, and she's an older Jewish Australian, she must be probably in her 60s now. And there was pressure by Israel's leading lobby group to pulp the book on the MUP board, which thankfully they resisted. But this gives you a sense of the hysteria. The hysteria about simply saying Palestinians are human beings, maybe Jews should think a bit more about what is being done to Palestinians in our name. And I think, to me, what I thought of then and now about this issue is that in many ways I see this as the threat, or the perceived threat, was me saying, and I wasn't the first one, but me saying, we are all culpable here. When I say we, I mean the Jewish community. We're culpable. We're culpable because we are the community that is backing blindly the Israeli project. Much of the Jewish diaspora, without that Jewish diaspora support, there would not be an occupation. There would not be arguably even an Israel. This is how it works. Yes, the US government's vital. Of course it is. But there's a reason why the US government and many governments support Israel. Lots of reasons. But a key reason is the Jewish diaspora putting pressure on various governments to support Israel. And if that Jewish diaspora is more critical or is fractured, which is increasingly happening, then Israel has a problem on its hands, which I'll get to. Anyway, that was a crazy time, light years away. And in the last 20 years, I've been visiting Israel-Palestine every 3 or 4 years, reporting from Jerusalem and Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And in 2016, I moved to East Jerusalem with my partner, who was then working for Oxfam, the NGO, and I was there for a number of years. And that's where the idea, I guess, for this book began. And I'm not the first one to say that Israel's battle-testing weapons. Others have said that. But I think what came to me was I wrote a book in 2015 and a film a few years after called Disaster Capitalism, which wasn't about Palestine at all, but it was about the idea of people making money from misery. I talked about the wars in Afghanistan, I was there, and various other places, making money from the aid industry, from the mining industry, immigration industry. And people have always made money from misery. That's true. But to me, what's happened in the 21st century is a massive acceleration of that globally. The nature of the ability for corporations to make money on a massively global scale is unprecedented in human history. So I guess that book came out and I started thinking about what I would do next, which ended up being a book on the drug war. But after that was thinking increasingly when I was there. I think before I went to Palestine in 2016, my thought had been, this is not sustainable. Meaning what's happening in Palestine now is not sustainable. Surely at some point, I thought in 2015-16, enough of the world will rise up and say, enough. And I think when I started living there, my view about that changed. Now, I'm not suggesting things can't change, and I mentioned they are changing. But the sense that things are, in my view, now, pretty permanent there. When I say permanent, I mean in the short to medium term, the situation in Palestine is the occupation is not reversible. It's done. There's ways to address that, which we'll get to. But my point being, it's not going to be a two-state solution. It's over. It was never going to happen anyway, in my view, but it's over. And when I guess, recognise the idea of how is Israel maintaining that occupation so, in their view, successfully? A few reasons. Obviously, it's global impunity. There's really no pressure on Israel whatsoever, which is a unique situation. Occasionally, the US might put out a terse press release about settlements, which Israel, of course, dismisses. Australia follows along like a little lapdog that we are. The EU puts out they're very concerned about the occupation, then they keep on trading with Israel more than they've ever traded before. The EU is Israel's biggest trading partner, by the way. So it's global impunity. But what also, to me, seems very clear, and this is what the book investigates, is the arms industry is central to this. Now, a lot of other countries sell arms. The US is the world's biggest arms dealer. It sells 40% of the world's weapons. The biggest by far are the countries in the top 10. There's Russia and France and others. Israel's not the only nation that sells weapons of death. I know that. But the difference with Israel is that it has a ready-made, occupied Palestinian population on its doorstep, permanently, to test a plethora of weapons. And I go into this in the book, that there's everything from drones to spyware to facial recognition technology to biometric data, a range of other tools, tested on Palestinians by mostly Israeli companies that have veterans from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and often from the intelligence arm of the IDF called Unit 8200, which is like the US NSA. Some of you may have heard of the NSA, which was, the NSA is essentially the world's biggest intelligence gathering unit, which is run by the US government. This is where the documents were exposed by Edward Snowden 10 years ago, detailing this mass surveillance unlike anything we've really imagined before. And Israel's Unit A200 is the equivalent of that in Israel, and regarded globally as equivalent to the NSA, even though Israel is a relatively tiny country with the occupied population 15 million people compared to the US, which is about 340. So many of these Israeli companies that are developing all these weapons are done by veterans who have spent decades surveilling and monitoring Palestinians. That's their job, 24/7. And when I started looking into this, the range of, not just the range of companies that were doing this, or that's obviously part of the story. This book is not like a business story. It's not a dry story about, well, this company does this company does that. It's part of that. It's more, the book really is, I guess, in three parts in a way. One part of it is to expose, that I think many people have said to me since the book came out we're not aware of, the profound extent of Israeli complicity in post-World War II awfulness around the world is unbelievable. Now, all of us on the left will say, well, we know what the US has been doing for 70 odd years in pretty much every corner of the globe. What is far less known is Israeli involvement and complicity in just as many countries. Now, I don't want to list them all because you want to go home at some point, but if you think of pretty much any repressive state in the last 75 years, I'll just give you a taste of a few. Iran during the Shah, South African apartheid for decades, which I'll come back to in a minute. The dirty wars that the US was pushing in Latin and South America in the 70s and 80s, and Israel was central to that. Funding, arming, training, death squads in Guatemala in the 80s at a time where Guatemala was actually committing genocide against its own indigenous population. Now, what's known about that is the US's involvement, relatively known, and there's been no accountability, but it's known, or more known. But the Israeli involvement is far less known. And that's not a conspiracy, but it's just less known. And I wanted to, I guess, uncover that, talk about that, and explain that, because I think that does go a long way to explaining why there is such global impunity, both in the past and now. Another reason I wrote the book was really as a warning. It was to say to people who maybe aren't as aware of these things that Israel really frames itself and sells itself as the world's greatest leading ethno-nationalist state. No one even comes close. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean a state that proudly discriminates against anyone who in this case is not Jewish. For those who don't know, as a Jew, I can go to Israel tomorrow, if they let me in. I can go to Israel tomorrow, and if I can prove that I'm Jewish, I can be a citizen within 2 or 3 months, have a passport. Now, I haven't done that ever, but for political reasons I refuse to do so because Palestinians have not got the same right, but I could do that tomorrow. And for many, many people, I think, around the world, there is not really an understanding of how influential this model is. And let me explain what I mean by that. I mentioned before apartheid South Africa, and that's a really important comparison point because apartheid ended in 1994, at least officially, although I would say there's still economic apartheid in South Africa today against the black population. But Israel and South Africa back then were the best of allies. And it's actually really important to understand why that's so relevant today. The world was profoundly, in the end, against apartheid South Africa. It took decades, but eventually they were. But during the height of apartheid, particularly in the 70s and 80s, Israel and South Africa were two things. They were defence partners. South Africa was buying huge amounts of weapons from Israel, but it was more than that. It was an ideological alignment. I have all these documents in the book from declassified documents which detail both sides profoundly admired what the other were doing. So Israel admired what South Africa was doing to its black population, and South Africa deeply admired what Israel was doing to the Palestinians. We are both in a war against barbarism. That's their words. We're fighting for our very survival here. That's their words. And that ideological alignment is important because until the end, the only country that stayed friends with South Africa until the end was Israel. Right to the end. Even when the US even when wonderful US in the end finally turned against South Africa, Israel didn't. Of course, I don't admit this now, but the documents prove that. And why is that relevant now? It's relevant now because so much of the occupation, I would argue, or at least part of the occupation, was deeply inspired by what South Africa was doing to its black population. Ariel Sharon, the now deceased, frankly, war criminal, former Israeli Prime Minister, had gone to South Africa decades ago and had seen what South Africa was doing to its black population, building these sort of bantustans. For those who don't know what that means, these sort of nominally self-controlled black communities. Essentially they were not, of course, but sort of black communities where the white population, of course, had power over them. And really admired what was happening there and wanted to do something similar in Palestine. And again, I'm not suggesting what's happening in Palestine is solely because of that, but it was a big inspiration for what Israel ended up doing. Keep in mind the fact the occupation, at least post-1967, although as I say in the book, in my view, the occupation started in 1948, but nonetheless, post-1967, it accelerated, of course. There were Jewish settlers in the West Bank, of course, and in Gaza. Initially a fringe movement, which has now become disturbingly very mainstream. But nonetheless, that was there. And so in the 70s, there weren't that many settlers in the West Bank yet, or Gaza. And the idea that so much of what Israel was doing could be mimicked on South Africa. Keep in mind, back then there was no real pressure on South Africa to change. It happened in the end. So why is that relevant today? It's relevant today because I see a lot of really concerning warning signs about where Israel is now inspiring the modern nation state. And the one that comes to mind, which I talk about a lot in the book, is India. Now, India, for those who don't know, is now the world's biggest nation, the world's biggest population, the world's biggest self-described democracy. Beat China this year because China's birth rate is declining, but India's is surging. And since Prime Minister Modi came into power in 2014, there has been a real, again, ideological alignment between Israel and India. Now, I'm not saying that India is doing what it's doing because of Israel. They're not. But they're deeply inspired. Let me explain what I mean by that. So what India is trying to do now under Modi is to build a Hindu fundamentalist state. They're not shy about it. They're open about it. The fact that much of the West is turning a blind eye to it is profoundly disturbing, including Australia, where anyone who was here a few months ago had the frankly undignified side of Albanese slobbering over Modi when he was here. Biden was slobbering over Modi at the White House a few months ago. Why? Because India is not China. I mean, we all know why this is happening. But what India is trying to do is to build a Hindu fundamentalist state to discriminate profoundly and against its 200 million Muslim population. There are regular pogroms now against Muslims. It does get a bit of international press, but not nearly enough. You have his Indian officials in the last years openly praising what Israel's doing in the West Bank, saying we want to do something very similar in Kashmir, which is what India is doing now, bringing huge amounts of Hindus from the south of India into Kashmir, which is a Muslim majority area. Now, India's not doing that, as I said again, because of Israel, but they're inspired by Israel. And this, to me, is where the threat lies. Ethno-nationalist states stick together. It's not like an official club, but they stick together. And the reason that's a threat, even beyond the Indian example, which is disturbing enough, is, it struck me in the last years noticing, and some people who might follow this will have noticed this too, if you go to far-right rallies, which I do for work purposes, just to be clear, not for fun, here and elsewhere, often you'll be surprised to find there are Israeli flags. Not always, but sometimes. Now, on the face of it, that might seem pretty weird. These are far-right, often Nazis, waving the flag of a Jewish state. What's going on? And I talk a lot about this in the book because this is really an important point that many people, I think, are not appreciating. I have a quote in the book from Richard Spencer. Some of you may remember that charming man from a few years ago. He's a so-called alt-right leader in the US. He got a lot of notoriety when Trump became president. He's still around. And he said, I'm a proud white Zionist. He's a proud white Zionist. Now, what does that mean for someone on the alt-right? Someone who traditionally doesn't like Jews, proudly a white Zionist. Let me tell you what it means. It means that there is a growing global, it's not an official coalition, but a coalescing of forces around the idea that Richard Spencer would say if he was here. What I admire, and he said this, and I have quotes in the book of this, I admire what Israel is doing to build a proud Jewish nation which benefits Jews solely. I want to create the same thing for Christians in my country. His country is the US. And there's a reason why you have Israeli officials, Israeli government officials, partnering, reaching out to far-right groups across Europe. Hungary, Austria, Spain, Romania. Often parties which historically are tied to neo-Nazis and fascists. So you have an Israeli government. I'm not just talking about the government this year, Netanyahu. I mean, he's been in power for seemingly ever, but didn't change much last year when he was not Prime Minister. There is a growing coalescing between the global far right and Israel. Now, I'm not saying everyone on the far right globally loves Israel. They don't. But it's a disturbing sign to me of where so much of this power is going, that they see Israel as the ultimate model. It's a model of not just Jewish supremacy, which is clear, but it's more than that. It's also, as I've said a lot in the last few months, it's the idea that you can get away with it. Now, you can't really sell that. This is not a weapon. You can't sell getting away with it. But it's an idea that says that you can get away with it, because people look at Israel and they say, you are getting away with it. No one's stopping them. As I said, beyond, well, to be discussed, but yes. I mean, global powers are not stopping them. There's obviously resistance within Palestine, but I mean in terms of global powers, what I mean, US, Europe, etc. So what I tried to do in the book is to, apart from, as I said, say what is happening should be a concern to all of us, is to explain why Israel, a tiny country, is now the 10th biggest arms dealer in the world. It sells weapons has sold weapons to over 130 countries in the world, which is the majority of nations on the planet, democracies and dictatorships. Not just the nations maybe you'd expect, democracies as well. Not that I'm saying democracies wouldn't buy that kind of technology, but they do. It might be the 10th arms dealer in the world, but it's one of the top spyware dealers in the world. Now, Kathy mentioned at the beginning Pegasus. For those who don't know what Pegasus is, I'll just briefly explain, because that's often what's been a way in for many people to this story, but there's also been a gap in how it's been covered. Pegasus is basically a phone hacking tool. So it's sold by a company called NSO Group, which, again, for veterans of the IDF in Israel, founded about 15 years ago, and its first major client was actually Mexico. Mexico was fighting then and now apocalyptic drug war. And they were sold on this idea that they could find out all the information about drug cartels by using very powerful spyware. And one aspect of this story, which you might not know, El Chapo, that infamous drug lord, was captured partly because of NSO Group and Pegasus. Interesting part of the story. Anyway, I have that in the book. But Mexico then and now, for a range of reasons, is the biggest user of Pegasus in the world. Under the right-wing government in the past, and even now when it's nominally left-wing, so they claim, obsessed with Pegasus. Now, how does Pegasus work? Years ago, you would maybe get a text message. You know, people often get random text messages. There's like a link, you click on it, you forget about it, you move on. That link would potentially infect your phone. Then you have no way of knowing. Now, all a country or military or intelligence needs is your number. That's it. iPhone, Android, that's it. Your phone's infected. And Pegasus has been sold to 70, 80, 90 countries around the world, democracies and dictatorships. And Pegasus is the tip of the iceberg. Now, I talk a lot in the book and interview huge numbers of people who were surveilled by Pegasus. Now, Pegasus doesn't kill you per se. It's not a drone. It's not a missile. But the people I spoke to in places like Mexico, Togo, India, these were journalists, human rights activists, others, that you can imagine in many countries, including here, but particularly in places which are deeply repressive, including democracies like India, so-called democracies, that if the state has access to your phone, which can potentially have all your information, contacts, photos, emails, of course, it potentially can have both personal information, which could be incriminating, or it could be just professional information about contacts or sources, whatever it may be. And a lot of the people that I spoke to felt completely violated, that they could never really, in one level, get their life back together again. I mean, they're mostly these people. Some people who have been surveilled have been killed. Many of them, they haven't been killed because they've been surveilled. They've been killed because they're a target of the state, Mexico or amongst other nations. And what I show in the book is that Israel has sold these tools and technologies as a diplomatic weapon. Let me explain what I mean by that. So I show in the book almost like a timeline where Israel in the last 10 years has tried very hard to make more friends. There are some in the Israeli elite who are aware, you might not really get this perception, but there is an awareness in parts of the Israeli elite that much of the world doesn't like what it's doing. They're not doing anything about it, but there's an awareness of that. So the aim is to make friends. I mean, transactional friendships is what I would call it. So Netanyahu or the Mossad has gone to many nations, UAE, Saudi, Rwanda, India, and they sort of hang Pegasus as a diplomatic tool, and they say, we'd love to see this amazing piece of technology. You can go after anyone you want. And in return, we'd like you to maybe vote in a certain way in the UN. That's how it works. And within 6 to 12 months in many of these countries, and I detail this in the book, these tools are in use, their dissidents are being surveilled, and Israel has more friends, so-called friends. In the last years, we've read a lot about Israel's apparent acceptance in the Arab world, so we're told. Some of you may remember during Donald Trump's presidency, the so-called Abraham Accords, which were this deal that said that Israel was now fully accepted in the Arab world, and there was a deal between UAE, Bahrain, Morocco in the end, and at the moment there's an attempt to bring Saudi on board. Now, apart from the fact that the idea that the Arab people love Israel, which was always bullshit. I mean, even in nations like Egypt or Jordan, which have been at peace for decades, if you see any polling of Egyptians or Jordanians, they ain't a fan of Israel. The governments love Israel, and all those nations I just mentioned were desperate to get Israeli weapons, arms. A few weeks ago, Israel released its 2022 arms figures. That's the latest we've got. 12.5 billion US, the highest ever, double in a decade. And 24% of those deals were to Arab autocracies. 24%. So what does that tell you? It tells you that they're pretty desperate for spyware and various other weapons. It also tells you that when they release the figures for this year, which will come out in the first half of next year, that figure's almost certainly to be higher. Why? Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, much of Europe has been begging Israel for huge amounts of weaponry, and they've been selling it mostly. Missile defence shields, missiles in general. Israel just signed its biggest deal ever with Germany recently for $3 billion US. Interestingly, Israel will not sell many weapons to Ukraine, the nation that's actually in a conflict with Russia. Why? It's complicated, but the short version is, for the last year, some of you may be aware that there's been this, of course you're aware, horrific civil war in Syria. And Israel has wanted to be allowed to bomb what they claim are Syrian and Iranian sites within Syria, but Russia has controlled the skies. And therefore, Israel doesn't want to piss off Putin and Russia, and if they sold weapons to Ukraine, they would. So in the last year and a half since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been huge amounts of US pressure and other pressure on Israel to sell weapons to Ukraine. They haven't sold many weapons at all, a few defensive weapons, despite all the pressure. And again, this comes, I guess, to maybe I might wrap up here before questions, is I really see the arms industry as an insurance policy for Israel. That, as I said at the beginning, there is a realisation amongst parts of the Israeli elite. I'm not talking about far-right fascists who are now in the Israeli government. They have a hubris and an arrogance which history would suggest they have good reason to be so, at least for now. I'm talking about the so-called cleverer Israeli elites. They realise at some point there's a tipping point. There always is in issues. So in the short to medium term, Israel could feel pretty confident that they have virtually no international opposition. They're selling weapons on a rate beyond anything imaginable. Despite the current Israeli, as many of you will be aware, there's lots of Israeli Jewish protests, lots of articles talking about a potential exodus of Israeli Jews. It hasn't really happened yet. the Israeli defence industry has not been interrupted by any of these protests, let me tell you. They are moving along smoothly. So I say it's an insurance policy because Israel feels, and often have quotes in the book explaining this, they feel in many ways that are nations likely in the short to medium term to criticise us if we're selling them the most essential weapons that they want? I would argue the answer to that's probably no, in the short to medium term. Now, again, South African apartheid shows that eventually, at some point, international pressure, in that case, boycott, divestment, sanctions, a range of other tools and tactics. There was a global pressure and a shift that South Africa was told you have a choice. You either continue as you are or you will be a pariah indefinitely. And South Africa made a variety of decisions and negotiations. In 1994, apartheid was officially over. And I guess I'll leave you with just this point that, to me, this can sound pretty damn grim. It's pretty grim. I'm not trying to have a silver lining on this. But one thing that is, and there's a lot of, actually I would say some degree of rays of hope, and it might not be so obvious when I speak, but one thing that has increasingly inspired me, amongst other things, and I discuss this in the book, is, for those of you who don't know, there is what I call, there's a growing Jewish insurgency happening in the Jewish community. It's happening. It's not so obvious here, although it's happening here. In the US, it is alive and well. And what I mean by that is this. For decades and decades and decades, since 48, but particularly since 67, there has been a Jewish establishment position, which was Israel right or wrong. Doesn't matter who's in the White House, Democrat, Republican, we will support and back Israel 110%. That's mostly now been an older generation. And what you find in the last 10 or so years is a growing number of young Jews. I'm not talking about 3 or 4 people, I'm talking about in large numbers, who are not just saying, not in my name, not just saying you don't speak for us, them being the Jewish establishment, the AIPACs and others, the Israel lobby, but putting massive pressure on other political forces, growing alternative organisations, Jewish Voice for Peace, amongst others, engaging BDS, engaging Palestinians. I mean, things on one level that should not be controversial, talking to Palestinians, crazy idea. But the fact is, for decades, the vast majority of a Jewish establishment did not speak to Palestinians. Even today, Australian and American politicians and journalists are going on Israel regularly, on Israel lobby trips paid for by Israel lobbyists. I'm talking about Labour and Liberal, Republican and Democrat, journalists across the board, even still today, on propaganda trips to kind of prop up the illusion of what Israel is. But I would say that's breaking down. And I don't want to, again, as I said at the beginning, exaggerate this shift in the Jewish community, but it is real. Now, how that plays out politically, of course, like all things, is how do you shift a political shift in the community to political power? And that's still very much a work in progress in the US. But that does encourage it, because in the last 5 years, there's been more change in the Jewish community in the US than there has been in the last 50. I'll leave it with that. A slight ray of hope.